For decades, the Arctic was treated like a frozen backwater. Too cold, too remote, too expensive to matter economically. That's changing faster than most people realize. Public reporting, government budget filings, and shipping forecasts now show that Canada is making one of the largest Arctic infrastructure investments in its history. New icebreakers, port upgrades, expanded northern logistics, long-term military and safety presence. On the surface, this sounds like a regional development story. But underneath, it connects to much bigger issues. Global shipping routes, critical minerals, energy security, trade resilience, North American defense coordination, and the unresolved legal fight over who actually controls the Northwest Passage. If Canada succeeds in turning this frozen corridor into a functioning commercial route, it could reshape how goods move between Asia, Europe, and North America, and how Arctic security is managed for decades. Tonight, we'll walk through what's happening, why it matters strategically, what it could mean for everyday costs and supply chains, and what realistic paths forward actually look like. No hype, no speculation. Just clear analysis based on what's publicly visible right now. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. At the center of this story is a group of Arctic waterways known collectively as the Northwest Passage. It's not one single channel. It's a network of sea routes weaving through Canada's Arctic archipelago, connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Historically, these routes were blocked by thick ice most of the year. Ships couldn't rely on them safely or consistently. That made the passage economically irrelevant for modern shipping. Over the last 2 decades, Arctic ice coverage has declined significantly during summer months. Shipping seasons have gradually lengthened. Icebreaker technology has improved. Satellite navigation and forecasting have become more reliable. As a result, the Northwest Passage is becoming increasingly navigable for part of the year, and potentially longer in the future with sufficient icebreaking support. That creates a strategic question. Who controls access to this route? Canada has long argued that the Northwest Passage consists of internal Canadian waters. Under that interpretation, vessels would require Canadian permission and must comply with Canadian regulations. The United States has historically taken a different legal position, arguing that the passage qualifies as an international strait where ships enjoy transit rights under international maritime law. This disagreement has existed for decades without causing major friction, largely because the route wasn't commercially practical until recently. What's new is Canada's shift toward building real physical capacity in the Arctic. Recent Canadian budgets and public announcements indicate increased funding for new heavy icebreakers, port modernization in northern regions, expanded Coast Guard and surveillance capabilities, transportation links supporting mining and logistics, and year-round operational readiness rather than seasonal presence. The goal appears to be making Arctic operations commercially viable, enforceable, and reliable rather than symbolic. That's what's driving renewed attention to this long-standing sovereignty dispute. The economic implications of this shift are substantial. If the Northwest Passage becomes a viable commercial shipping route, it could fundamentally alter global trade patterns. The route offers a significantly shorter path between major Atlantic and Pacific ports compared to traditional routes through the Panama Canal or around South America's Cape Horn. For shipping between Europe and Asia, the distance savings could be even more dramatic, potentially cutting thousands of nautical miles from current routes through the Suez Canal. These distance reductions translate directly into reduced fuel costs, shorter transit times, and lower insurance premiums for vessels that would otherwise face piracy risks in traditional choke points. Major shipping companies and resource extraction firms are already conducting feasibility studies and monitoring ice conditions with increasing interest. The prospect of accessing northern mineral deposits, previously locked away by ice and distance, adds another layer of economic incentive. However, the environmental fragility of the Arctic complicates this picture considerably. The region's ecosystems are uniquely vulnerable to disruption from shipping traffic, potential oil spills, ballast water discharge, and underwater noise pollution that affects marine mammals. Indigenous communities whose traditional ways of life depend on these waters have raised serious concerns about the impacts of increased vessel traffic on wildlife migration patterns, fishing grounds, and cultural practices that have endured for millennia. Canada's regulatory framework for the passage reflects these environmental concerns. Canadian law requires vessels to meet stringent environmental standards, carry adequate insurance, use experienced ice navigators, and report their positions regularly. These regulations are presented as necessary protections for a delicate ecosystem, but they also serve to reinforce Canadian authority over the waters in question. If ships must comply with Canadian rules, the legal argument that these are internal waters gains practical weight regardless of the formal legal status. The legal dispute itself rests on technical interpretations of international maritime law. International straits, under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, are waters that connect two parts of the high seas or exclusive economic zones and are used for international navigation. Ships passing through such straits enjoy transit passage rights, meaning coastal states cannot require permission or impose certain restrictions. Canada argues that the Northwest Passage doesn't meet this definition because it hasn't historically been used for international navigation, precisely because it was icebound. The United States counters that the potential for navigation, not just historical use, determines strait status. This legal technicality carries enormous practical implications. If the passage is recognized as an international strait, Canada loses the ability to control who passes through, what ships carry, and what safety or environmental standards they must meet. If it's internal waters, Canada can require notification, charge fees, mandate the use of Canadian pilots, and even deny passage to certain vessels entirely. Other Arctic and near-Arctic nations are watching this dispute with keen interest. Russia faces similar questions about the Northern Sea route along its Arctic coast and has taken an assertive stance on requiring permission and charging fees for passage. China, despite having no Arctic territory, has declared itself a near-Arctic state and has expressed strong interest in what it calls the Polar Silk Road. European nations with shipping interests are evaluating how this legal ambiguity might affect their commercial opportunities. The security dimensions add yet another layer of complexity. Military vessels, particularly submarines, have strategic reasons for wanting unimpeded access to Arctic waters. The United States Navy's position on the Northwest Passage isn't merely about commercial shipping freedom. It's about maintaining the principle that international straits remain open to military transit. Canada's assertion of sovereignty, conversely, is partly about ensuring that foreign military vessels cannot pass through what Canada considers its territorial waters without permission. Climate change ensures that this issue will only grow in importance. Current projections suggest that by mid-century, the Northwest Passage could be ice-free for several months each year, making it increasingly attractive for commercial use. What remains an occasional route for specially equipped vessels today could become a major shipping lane within a generation. The legal framework established now will shape Arctic governance for decades to come, making the current Canadian investments in physical infrastructure and operational capability particularly significant. Canada appears to be pursuing a strategy of establishing facts on the ground, or rather facts on the ice, that will make its sovereignty claims increasingly difficult to challenge regardless of the formal legal arguments. If the Northwest Passage becomes consistently usable, it shortens shipping distances between Asia and parts of North America and Europe. In practical terms, shorter routes can mean reduced fuel consumption, faster transit times, lower operating costs for shipping companies, and less congestion pressure on routes like the Panama Canal. Over long time horizons, even small percentage shifts in global shipping volumes can represent hundreds of billions of dollars in trade flows. But shipping is only one part of the equation. The Canadian Arctic contains substantial deposits of critical minerals, including nickel, copper, zinc, rare earth elements, and other materials essential for electric vehicles, batteries, power grids, defense manufacturing, and advanced electronics. Historically, many of these resources were economically difficult to develop due to transportation barriers. Without reliable ports, roads, and shipping access, costs remained high. Infrastructure changes that calculation. If ports and shipping lanes become dependable, previously marginal projects can become commercially viable. That strengthens Canada's position in critical mineral supply chains at a time when many countries are trying to diversify away from concentrated sources. There's also a security dimension. The Arctic has become more strategically relevant for Russia, China, and NATO countries as ice retreats and navigation improves. Surveillance, search and rescue, environmental protection, and military monitoring all become more important as traffic increases. Who controls traffic management, enforcement, and safety standards has real implications for continental security and alliance coordination. So this isn't just about ships moving faster. It's about trade resilience, supply chain security, resource access, and geopolitical positioning in a region that was previously dormant. The convergence of these factors creates a fundamentally different strategic landscape than existed even a decade ago. When the Arctic was largely inaccessible, sovereignty disputes remained theoretical exercises for international lawyers. Now, as physical access becomes reality, abstract legal positions must translate into concrete policies with measurable economic and security consequences. Consider the implications for global manufacturing and trade networks. Modern supply chains are built on predictability and timing precision. Just-in-time manufacturing relies on knowing exactly when components will arrive. A route that's only navigable during unpredictable summer windows doesn't integrate well into these systems. But a route with reliable seasonal schedules, backed by icebreaker support and modern port facilities, begins to look like viable infrastructure rather than an interesting geographic curiosity. Canadian investments in year-round operational capacity signal an intention to provide that reliability, transforming the Northwest Passage from an occasional shortcut into a genuine alternative route that logistics planners can incorporate into their models. The critical minerals dimension adds urgency to this infrastructure development. Current global supply chains for materials like lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements are heavily concentrated in a small number of countries, creating strategic vulnerabilities that many governments now view as unacceptable. Canada possesses significant deposits of many of these materials, but extraction in the Arctic presents extraordinary challenges. Operating costs in remote, harsh environments are prohibitive unless transportation infrastructure can bring those costs down to competitive levels. The difference between a mineral deposit that requires expensive air transport versus one accessible by reliable marine shipping can determine whether a project proceeds at all. This matters particularly for allied countries seeking to reduce dependence on potentially adversarial nations for strategic materials. A Canadian Arctic that can efficiently extract and transport critical minerals offers Western allies a friendly, stable source within their security sphere. This alignment of economic and security interests provides powerful motivation for Canadian infrastructure investment and equally powerful motivation for allied nations to support Canadian sovereignty claims over the shipping routes that would make such resource development viable. The security implications extend beyond resource access. Arctic waters have long served as patrol routes for ballistic missile submarines seeking the cover of ice and the acoustic protection of a noisy, complex underwater environment. As ice coverage diminishes, that environment changes. Submarines become more detectable, but surface vessels and aircraft gain greater access for surveillance and enforcement. Control over shipping routes means control over who can place sensors in these waters, who can establish navigational aids that might serve secondary intelligence purposes, and who sets the rules for vessel identification and tracking. China's growing interest in Arctic affairs, despite its geographic distance from the region, reflects recognition of these strategic realities. Chinese companies have invested in Arctic research stations, mining projects, and shipping studies. Chinese military publications discuss Arctic routes as future strategic corridors. For Canada and its NATO allies, the question of whether foreign military and intelligence vessels can transit the Northwest Passage without permission or monitoring takes on heightened importance in this context. Canadian sovereignty over the passage means Canada, in coordination with allies, controls access. International strait status means China, Russia, or any other nation could claim transit rights. The economic calculus also extends to insurance and liability frameworks. Who bears responsibility when something goes wrong in Arctic waters? If an oil spill occurs, which nation's environmental laws apply? Which Coast Guard responds? Which courts have jurisdiction over disputes? These aren't hypothetical questions. As traffic increases, incidents become statistical inevitabilities. The legal framework established now will determine how future accidents are handled, who pays for cleanup, and what standards ships must meet to operate in these sensitive environments. Indigenous communities in Canada's Arctic territories add another crucial dimension to this discussion. These communities have inhabited and navigated Arctic waters for thousands of years, developing detailed knowledge of ice conditions, wildlife patterns, and environmental changes. Their input into shipping regulations and environmental protection measures provides both practical expertise and moral authority to Canadian governance claims. International recognition of Indigenous rights strengthens Canada's position that these waters fall within its jurisdiction, since the communities most directly affected by shipping traffic are Canadian citizens whose rights and interests the Canadian government has obligations to protect. The infrastructure investments Canada is making represent a long-term commitment that goes beyond symbolic gestures. Building heavy icebreakers takes years and costs hundreds of millions of dollars per vessel. Port facilities in permafrost environments require specialized engineering and ongoing maintenance. Training personnel for Arctic operations demands sustained institutional investment. These are not easily reversible decisions. They signal that Canada intends to maintain a permanent, capable presence in its Arctic territories, backing its legal claims with operational reality. This approach recognizes that international law, while important, is ultimately interpreted and enforced through state capacity and international recognition. If Canada can demonstrate consistent, effective governance of the Northwest Passage, ensuring safety, protecting the environment, managing traffic, responding to emergencies, its sovereignty claims gain practical legitimacy regardless of technical legal debates. Countries using the route may find it simpler to work within Canadian regulatory frameworks than to challenge them, especially if those frameworks are reasonable, efficiently administered, and backed by real enforcement capability. The timeline matters significantly. Infrastructure takes years to build. International legal precedents develop slowly. Climate change continues regardless of human decision-making timelines. Canada appears to be positioning itself to have capable infrastructure in place before shipping traffic reaches levels that would make disputes urgent and contentious. This proactive approach allows Canada to establish norms and procedures while traffic is still manageable, rather than trying to assert control over a busy, established shipping lane where numerous countries have already developed expectations of unrestricted access. So what does any of this mean for normal people? First, shipping costs influence consumer prices. When transportation routes become shorter or more efficient, that can eventually reduce the cost of moving goods like electronics, machinery, clothing, and industrial materials. Those savings don't always show up immediately, but they shape long-term inflation pressures. Second, energy and mineral supply stability matters for everything from electricity infrastructure to electric vehicles to national manufacturing competitiveness. Reliable access to critical minerals helps stabilize pricing and reduces exposure to geopolitical disruptions. Third, infrastructure investment creates jobs. Port construction, shipbuilding, logistics operations, mining development, and regional services generate employment and secondary economic activity, particularly in northern regions that historically had limited opportunities. Fourth, resilient trade routes reduce vulnerability to choke points. Disruptions in major canals or congested ports can ripple through global supply chains. Diversifying routes improves overall system stability. Most people won't ever see the Northwest Passage firsthand, but they feel its effects indirectly through prices, availability of goods, energy reliability, and economic resilience over time. From an industry perspective, several sectors are watching this closely. Shipping companies monitor route reliability, insurance costs, regulatory clarity, and seasonal predictability before committing assets. Arctic navigation remains expensive and technically demanding, so adoption would likely be gradual rather than sudden. Mining and resource firms evaluate infrastructure timelines carefully. Port capacity, rail access, icebreaking availability, and regulatory frameworks determine whether projects move forward or remain on hold. Shipbuilding industries benefit from icebreaker procurement and Arctic-capable vessel demand. Insurance markets assess risk differently as Arctic traffic increases. Search and rescue capabilities, environmental safeguards, and incident response capacity influence premiums and underwriting decisions. Governments track strategic exposure. Arctic infrastructure intersects with national security planning, emergency response coordination, and international legal frameworks. Historically, major infrastructure transitions unfold over decades, not overnight. Early investments signal direction rather than immediate transformation. There are real constraints and uncertainties. Arctic construction is expensive and technically difficult. Weather, logistics, labor availability, and environmental sensitivity raise costs and slow timelines. Ice conditions remain unpredictable. Even with warming trends, year-round reliability depends heavily on icebreaker support and weather variability. Environmental risks are significant. Increased shipping raises spill risk, wildlife disruption, and long-term ecological concerns that require strict regulation and monitoring. Legal disputes remain unresolved internationally. Differing interpretations of maritime law could create friction if traffic increases. Geopolitical dynamics are complex. Coordination among allies, competition with other Arctic actors, and regulatory alignment all introduce uncertainty. Economic projections rely on assumptions that may shift with global trade patterns, energy transitions, or technological changes. In other words, this is a strategic opportunity but not a guaranteed payoff. Scenario 1. Gradual expansion. Canada continues steady infrastructure investment. Seasonal shipping increases modestly. Regulatory frameworks mature slowly. Cooperation with allies remains stable. Commercial usage grows incrementally. Scenario 2. Accelerated strategic investment. Higher commodity demand and geopolitical pressures accelerate Arctic development. More private investment flows into ports and logistics. Traffic increases faster, requiring stronger coordination on safety and security. Scenario 3. Cautious plateau. Cost overruns, environmental concerns, or market shifts slow expansion. Infrastructure improves, but commercial adoption remains limited. Strategic benefits emerge slowly. All three remain plausible depending on policy choices, global demand, and operational realities. The Northwest Passage is becoming more economically relevant due to changing ice conditions and infrastructure investment. Canada is expanding physical Arctic capacity, which strengthens its ability to manage shipping and resource development. The shift affects trade efficiency, supply chains, energy security, and regional employment over the long term. Outcomes depend on execution, environmental management, legal coordination, and geopolitical stability. I'd love to hear your perspective. Do you see Arctic shipping becoming a meaningful part of global trade, or do you think costs and risks will keep growth limited? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thoughtful discussion helps everyone understand these issues better. If you value clear, grounded analysis like this, consider subscribing so you don't miss future breakdowns. Thanks for watching.